Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a brand new guest. Her name is Annie B. Jones. She has written an incredible book. I highly recommend it. Ordinary Time: Lessons Learned While Staying Put. And so Annie, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have time with you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Glenn. I'm excited to be here.
Definitely. So before we get into the book, maybe could you take a few moments to tell us about yourself, especially for people who are new to you, new to your work. You're a wife, mom, podcaster, you own a bookstore. Take us into
Yeah.
the life of Annie B. Jones.
I am the owner of The Bookshelf, which is an independent bookstore in Thomasville, Georgia. I always like to clarify that Thomasville is nowhere near Atlanta. We are rural South Georgia, right across the Florida-Georgia line. I grew up in nearby Tallahassee, Florida, hence writing a book about staying in one place. I'm also the host of our store podcast. It's called From the Front Porch, where we have conversations about books, small business, and life in the South. Um, I have been married to my husband Jordan for 16 plus years, and we are currently pregnant with our first baby. And so that is really exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you to be releasing a book and a baby into the world
A book
during the
and a
same
human.
year. Yeah, it was not quite the original plan, but that's okay. We're delighted and surprised by this, yeah, next chapter. So, um, I think that's a little bit about me. We live in Thomasville near the bookstore. We moved here on purpose so that we
Mhm.
could run that shop. We live with our dog Sam Malone. He plays a big role in our lives and in the book actually. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me and my life.
That's awesome. I used to work at Barnes and Noble way back
Ah,
in the day. I was a bookshelver, and it was
yeah.
one of my first jobs. And I was like, what do I want to do? Do I want to go to do some kind of retail thing because it'd be the easiest job to get, for
Yeah.
what I was doing. And I was like, man, what do I want to do? I love books. I don't really
hmm
want to sell books. I don't really want to stand at the register, but I'd love
hmm
to flip through books. So I was like, wonder if I could be like a book shelver. And then I looked online and they had those jobs. I'm like, oh, this is great. So I was like every morning from like 7 to 11, which worked well because I was in grad school at the time. And so then I
Okay.
was able to go right to school after that. But it was like 3 or 4 hours of just getting to thumb through books and put them
Oh, that
on the
sounds
shelves. And it
great.
was the best. I came across so many books I was like, had no idea even existed just
Yeah.
by doing that role. So
What an education. I listen, book selling is one of the joys of my life, but book shelving sounds even better for an introvert.
yes, and I got my coffee with me on my cart in the morning. It was the
Yeah.
best. It was the
Yeah, that
best.
sounds really chill. That sound amazing.
Sometimes I get spoken to and they say, you got to go a little faster. You can't thumb through books quite as much. I'm like, all right, sorry. So your book is divided into five different parts, and they each
hmm
take us through a different area of life where people either stay or move on. And
hmm
so there's staying friends, there's staying put, staying faithful, staying grounded, staying you. And so I thought it would be fun for us to kind of maybe make our way through these sections, maybe two
Okay,
or three, or maybe all of them. We'll see how far we're able to go. But before
sure.
we jump in, can you maybe give our listeners a quick synopsis, crash course, elevator pitch of what they can expect if they get this book? What's it about? And where did your passion really come from for this?
I wanted to write a book that wasn't necessarily a how-to manual. This isn't, and I think I use that word,
Mhm.
that phrasing exactly in
Yep.
the introduction. This is not a how to love your neighbor book. It's not a how to stay book. I wanted to write the kind of book I love to read, which is stories. And right at this moment, I don't think I'm quite capable of the fiction that I love so much. But what I do feel fairly capable of is writing stories that are true to my life and that I am living every day. And so I wanted this to be a book of stories. I didn't want it to be a book of theological truths or 10 steps or anything like that. I just wanted to write about what it's been like in my experience to stay. And that means literally stay near my hometown, stay in this small town, stay in my career, stay in book selling for 12 plus years, stay married, stay faithful when faith has seemed extremely difficult and challenging, staying friends with the people I've known since I was 8 years old. So that is kind of what the stories revolve around. And really, when I sat down to write a book proposal, I knew I wanted to write essays. I knew I wanted I felt like that was what I was best at was essays. But I wasn't sure about the theme. And then as like I started to sketch out what I wanted the essays to be about, the theme kind of popped up because I think this idea of staying is one that I'm not only writing about, but I'm constantly talking about with my friends. I mean, after the pandemic, a lot of my friends moved to be closer to their aging parents, so that their kids could be near their grandparents or whatever. And then all throughout my 20s, because I lived in Tallahassee, because I lived in this rather transient college town, at least in part, a lot of my friends moved and left. And so I felt like I had experienced this and I had seen other people experience this. And so I wanted to write about, okay, but what happens when you don't leave? What happens when you wind up staying, whether it's literally or metaphorically? And then I also wanted to acknowledge what happens when you leave, because sometimes leaving is what you're supposed to do. And I've experienced that in my faith life a little bit. And so I hope I address leaving with tenderness as well. But that is what people can kind of expect. I don't want them to go in and think, oh, this is some kind of like theologically deep treatise or a how-to book or no, this is essays about an ordinary life. What happens when you don't live your big adventure, your big city adventure dreams? Um, is the life that you've chosen, is the quiet life that you've chosen, um, worthwhile? Is it full of stories? And I think it is.
Yeah, and I felt like, the kind of one of the big points that I got in the book is that you can pursue your dreams could be beyond your wildest imagination if you pursue them in the place where you are. That might be your calling, so to speak, is to pursue that thing here as opposed to some faraway place. And I feel like what a radical statement to make in a culture where it's really like almost a badge of honor to always be moving on. Like it's always
Yeah.
you're always in this place, but you're always thinking about the next place. And I think even back
Yes.
when I was like in school and I went to seminary, it was always about the next thing you were gonna do. Like you're gonna
Hmm.
graduate, you're gonna go be a youth pastor. But when you're a youth pastor, you're gonna be thinking about being a senior pastor. When you're a senior pastor, you're thinking about denominational level stuff. So it's always like this thing of like moving
Yes.
on as opposed to just planting yourself and just being where you are. And I think that's such a heartfelt thing for this culture that we're in.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing to me. Some of my friends, when I was first talking about the book, they rightly pointed out, they were like, but Annie, you're getting to live your dream of being, for example, a bookstore owner. That was a dream that I had that I really did not think would ever come to fruition. Maybe in retirement would come to fruition. And I told my friend, no, you're exactly right, but I'm living it in a place I never would have expected, like rural South Georgia. Like I never would have anticipated that or predicted that. And so it has been a delightful surprise to see the ways you can live out these things that you really wanted, these goals, these, um, I don't know, these callings, like you said, but you might be living them in a different place than you originally thought.
That's right. That's right. Let's talk about friendship, the first
Hmm.
part of the book. And I feel like this section really challenged me because I don't have like lots and lots of flesh and blood friends like in the flesh. Like I have a lot of virtual friends
Yeah,
because this podcast is now
nature of your
7 years
work.
old. Yeah, and so we have a lot of virtual people we've connected with around the world, which is awesome. But my
Hmm.
wife and I, we grew up in New Jersey, and 7 years ago we packed up and we moved to North Carolina to a
Okay.
place where we didn't really know anybody. And so,
Hmm.
those close, again, flesh and blood friends are far and few between. And
Yeah.
so for me, it's probably mainly a lot of it's mainly my own doing because I'm an introvert. And so I'm pretty content to be home with my
Hmm.
books and my paints and a pot of coffee. And I go back and forth between, work and play and things like that. But also, like in the past, I think a lot of people probably say this too, is I've been burned by people
Mm,
in the past that I opened up to. And
hmm.
sometimes at 43 years old, it feels like why even bother? We're just
Right.
gonna get hurt again anyway. But this section in particular, you talk about how not every person that we meet needs to be a potential best friend. Like that's a lot of pressure to put on ourselves and
Yes.
also on other people, and how we can be friends with people even if we aren't best friends, even if it's just surface level, it's acquaintances that we meet. the checkout at the grocery store, or I
Hmm.
think you talk about, going to the actual checkout lane versus the self-checkout, or going
Yes.
up to the Starbucks counter versus doing the mobile ordering, getting to know your
Yes.
baristas, things like that. So all that to say, can you maybe talk to us about some of the lessons that you've
Yeah.
learned regarding friendship? Because I think that's something a lot of people struggle with as we become adults. We move into jobs, family life, bill paying. It can be incredibly hard to breathe, much less to
Hmm.
have time to invest in friendships. And so, what have you
Yeah.
learned about friendships? Give us some wisdom.
Well, I think, these are still lessons I'm learning in real time,
Yeah.
but I do think those of us who were raised on 90s sitcoms like Friends or How I Met Your Mother or something like that, we think friendship has to look a certain way. And there may be a season in our lives when it does look that way. For some people, it may have been college, where you have like a really close-knit group of college friends. I went to college and I made some really close friends, but I remember almost having a feeling of disappointment because I was like, oh, well, I don't know that I have like a group. Like, I don't know that I have this core group of people that I spend all my time with. I occasionally did. And I think probably the biggest lesson I've learned over the course of adulthood is many friendships are seasonal. And for a tried and true person who loves lifelong friends, that has been a hard lesson to learn that not every friendship is supposed to be the same kind of friendship you had with the girl you met when you were 8 years old, in my case. And so really holding friendship with an open hand and saying, okay, we may not be lifelong friends, we may not be best friends forever, but we might be friends for a season. And I'm not naturally good at this kind of friendship, but I think moving to a small town where I actually found friend making to be far more difficult than in a larger city. Not that Tallahassee's huge, but um, finding friends in a smaller geographical location was incredibly difficult. And so I think I had to kind of lower the bar and stop looking for BFF, best friend forever, and instead be really content with the women in my book club or the the passing acquaintance in church or the lady at the checkout counter at the grocery store or my friend who runs the yarn shop. Like I think I had to just adjust what my expectations were about friendship. So holding friendship with an open hand, being willing to have seasonal friendships, and then kind of lowering the bar, which is
Yeah.
something I talk about a lot in the book in various themes. I'm a high expectations person,
Yeah, me
and
too.
and kind of lowering the bar on friendship, on relationship, has really been helpful. And it's interesting because this is not a book that is heavy on research or anything like that. But while I was writing, there was so much conversation in the zeitgeist about the loneliness epidemic. Like I just kept seeing articles, in the Atlantic or the New York Times about the loneliness epidemic. And what I found fascinating was over and over again this emphasis not on finding your new best friend, but on talking to people. I think this is especially true in a post-pandemic landscape, but talking to people in line at the store or yes, choosing a checkout lane instead of a self-checkout lane. Ordering your food and picking it up or eating, heaven forbid we eat in a restaurant. Like
Right.
like
Like
go
it.
like eating in a restaurant instead of having it delivered through DoorDash or whatever. And I thought that was so interesting that this whole time maybe we thought loneliness could be solved by finding like our kindred spirits like Anne and Diana. And maybe that's not it at all. Maybe it's, oh, but when I go out to dinner, even when I go out for a solo lunch, I love a solo lunch. But when I go out for a solo lunch, I'm making eye contact and I'm interacting with and having brief snippets of conversation with the person who's serving my meal, the person who's taking my order. Um, and so I think those lessons I learned through small town life and through the inconveniences, quite frankly, of small town existence. DoorDash here is terrible. I can't really get a lot of things DoorDash. I have to go, and honestly, it's probably quite good for me. It's probably better
Mhm.
for me as a highly introverted person to occasionally get out of my house and go interact with somebody who I might not otherwise interact with. And so those are some things that I have learned over the years. And again, I'm still learning them. even friendships I've written about in the book have changed a lot since I wrote about them. And so I think it's just kind of being content with, I don't know, riding the wave of friendship wherever it takes you, as cheesy and ridiculous as that sounds.
Yeah, I think I love the idea just of lowering the bar because
Hmm.
the other day I was at the park with my daughter and she's
Hmm.
8 and
Okay.
she can make friends with anybody. She walked
Hmm.
up to this little girl, she's like, "You want to be my friend?" And she's like, the guy was like, "Sure." And they went off and they played. I'm like, "How do you do that?"
I was about to say, weren't you a little jealous? It
Yeah,
seems
like
so
how do you
simple,
do
doesn't it?
that? But then I
Yeah.
thought to myself, like, she's never gonna see this person maybe again because it's just a random interaction at the park.
Right.
But yet she felt that bond with her for the time that she was playing. And I thought to myself,
Yes.
I spend so much, like I feel like I probably have more friends than I realize I have because
Yes.
again, like, being burned in the past, I feel like those were by like people who I considered best
Hmm.
friends. And the last person, like, there's been 2 years since I talked to this person for various reasons, and everything kind of ended. I didn't know why. And I'm like, man, I don't ever want that to happen again. So I'm going to protect myself. But yet
Mm,
I realize that not everybody has to be that level of friendship. Maybe someone will come along one day who
right.
becomes that deeper level. That's fine. But that doesn't mean I don't have any friends. Like I can probably rattle off
Right.
15 or 20 people right now who I interact with on a weekly basis, whether it's in the school pickup line,
Hmm.
picking up my daughter, whether it is going to Starbucks or in the grocery store. And there's just people who you have those interactions that we often take for granted because we just
Hmm.
assume they're just meaningless, but they're not meaningless at all.
Yeah, I don't know when we started to define friendship. And again, like I use the term kindred spirit from Anne of Green Gables. Like I definitely grew up with those ideas, like that somebody had to be your best friend forever, your closest, your person. If you were a Grey's
Yep.
Anatomy fan, like, um, and I do think occasionally there are those people in our lives. I mean, I could name them for you. I certainly have experienced those, but I do think we do other relationships and other people a disservice when we think that's the only path to friendship. I think
Yep.
your daughter is a great example of your daughter probably went home and told you like I made a new friend, like, and then she may not talk to that person ever again, and it doesn't matter.
That's
It does
right.
not matter to your daughter.
Yep.
And so I think that's a great example of, I think we were made for connection, even if we're introverts, even if we're quiet, even if we're shy. I think we were made for connection. But connection doesn't necessarily have to mean, oh, I tell my deepest secrets to this person, or, oh, we're going to be best friends for the next 20 years. It could just mean, oh, yeah, I see her every time I drop off my kid,
Yep.
or I see her drinking lemonade after church every Sunday. And that could be all it ever is. And that would be okay.
That's right. That's right. So good. All right, section 2 of the book
Mm-hmm.
is called Staying Put. And you
Mm-hmm.
tell the story of how when you moved to Thomasville, you and your husband, his name is Jordan, correct?
Yes, that's
That's
right.
also my daughter's name.
Oh, okay. That's fun.
Yeah, so you guys found yourself trying to fit in and be like everybody else who was kind of already there. And you
Yeah.
have this really great paragraph, and I wanted just to read it for our listeners really
Okay.
quick. You say, where is it? Here it is. We finally stopped saying yes to things that didn't feel like us. I didn't attend any more galas. Jordan never hunted quail. Those things were fine, but they weren't what we'd done anywhere else in any of our previous lives. Buying the bookstore hadn't changed who we were, so perhaps it was time to stop pretending that it had. And
Mm,
I love that, like this idea of staying put, staying put in who you are, right? And staying true to
mhm,
yourself. And so maybe could you talk to us a little bit about, I think again, something we all experience, that lure, that temptation that you've maybe felt to almost like disown yourself, leave yourself to become a
mhm.
version of yourself that you think like everybody around you wants you to be.
Yeah.
Again, something I think we can all relate to. But what have you learned by staying put, staying true to you?
I think when you move to a new place, there's immediately this idea that like maybe it's your chance to become a new person. And I don't think this happens just when we move cities. I think it happens even, I mean, haven't you ever moved into a new house and you think, "Oh, I'm going to be
Gonna
I'm going to be
remake
so
myself.
neat."
This is
Yes, I'm
it.
going to be so neat and
It's
organized
a
in my
new
house.
me.
Yes. I mean, I get that feeling whenever, yeah, I switch environments or what have you. And so when we moved to Thomasville, I do think there was a part of me that thought, "Okay, this is a new part in our lives." I think we were 27, 28 years old. And so I thought, okay, this is like, we're restarting adulthood here. Like we're gonna kind of maybe not even reinvent ourselves because I've never been one inclined to reinvention. Um, but I did think, okay, now's our chance. We're gonna be real grown-ups now. Like we've exited the your early 20s, your mid 20s, like we're moving into our latter 20s. Like we need to figure out who we're going to be. And we looked around and so many of the people our age, um, Thomasville was just so culturally different from anywhere we'd lived before. And so, yes, lots of people went quail hunting on the weekends or invited us to occasional like black tie galas. We didn't even, Jordan's never, I don't think Jordan's ever rented or certainly not owned. I don't even think worn a tux. And so at first it just felt like, oh, is this what we need to do? And I think part of it too for us was tied into owning a business in a town and trying to prove ourselves, trying to show we had bought this existing business. The bookshelf had existed in Thomasville already. So we were taking over this beloved like institution. And I wanted to do whatever necessary to prove to the town that like we were trustworthy, that we would steward her well. And if that meant attending galas or, going to dinner parties, then so be it. Like that's what we would do. And I think I went to one gala and then it was a really interesting experiment, but I felt so deeply uncomfortable. And that I think that's when I kind of realized, oh, I'm doing Thomasville a disservice by trying desperately to like pigeonhole myself into like what I assume their expectations are when really the best thing I can offer Thomasville is myself. When I'm at my most comfortable, that is when I'm at my best, is when I am comfortable, my most comfortable, my most the truest version of myself. I certainly believe in making ourselves uncomfortable on occasion, but I guess what I mean is like when I feel at peace or at home in my personhood, that is when I can, I think, offer my best work, offer my best self. And so I think this quote, I quote it in the book and I say it all the time and in my home and in my life, but it's this Flannery O'Connor quote that says, when in Rome, do as you done in Milledgeville. Flannery O'Connor is a Southern Gothic writer. She was from Milledgeville, Georgia, a pretty tiny little speck on the map. And I love this idea that no matter where you are, do what you would have done where you grew up or do what you would have done as a younger person or as a person most at home in yourself. And so I think when we finally started to do that, Thomasville immediately felt more like home. I mean, immediately. Um, I mean, we talk about it took, I would never want to be unrealistic about this, but it took about 10 years to feel like we belonged in Thomasville and Thomasville belonged to us, which is a long time. That's a long time. I don't know that that would be true in another place, but in a rooted small community, it took 10 years. I I don't know, but it might have taken less time if I had realized earlier, oh, Thomasville doesn't want me to be Thomasville. Thomasville wants me to be Annie. And I can do that. That I have practice in and that I know how to do. Um, and I just fell more in love with Thomasville when I stopped trying to be what I thought Thomasville wanted me to be. When really I don't think Thomasville cared that much.
Hmm.
Like I just don't think they cared that much if I went quail hunting or not.
Right.
And so, I think that's probably, yeah, that's how long it took. I wish it hadn't taken that long. But I think that realization of, oh, I can be myself here was a huge part of us finally feeling at home in this small town.
Mhm. But there, I mean, there's lessons in that. Like you say, it could have taken less time if you would
Hmm.
have known that. But at the same time, like look at how much you learned in that time of, oh
Yeah.
wow, like it really is important to be myself. Because you could look back on all those experiences that you
Yes.
had of trying to be maybe somebody else, and then
Yeah.
realize, man, such a disconnect there, and that makes the connection you have with yourself, I would think, so much more powerful. When I was reading this part of the book, I was thinking back on my own journey and when I was in seminary. I started
Mm.
seminary, and I went right out of college in the seminary, and
Okay.
it's hilarious when I look back on it now. But I had long hair down to my shoulders, and I would wear cut off shirts and cut off jeans and everything, and my ears were pierced, and I had highlights in my hair, and I listened to Green Day and like all this different stuff, and I never forget I rolled in the parking lot on my first day and got out of the car dressed just like that, walk in, and the secretary at the desk was like, can I help you? And I was like, yes, I'm here for my first day of class. And she's like, oh, and she's like, it's downstairs in the chapel. That's where everybody's meeting. So, okay. I go downstairs to the chapel and I walk in, everybody's got suits on and they're all dressed up. And I'm like, oh man, look at me. Right. So I go over and I sit down in the corner. And my professor, one of the professors I knew, came over and he sat down and he looked at me and he laughed and he said, don't let this place change you.
Mm,
He said, because if you let it, it will.
yeah.
And over time, I let it because I wanted to be what I thought everybody wanted me to be. Like,
Hmm.
if I see this group over here who's really in with this professor, I want to be in with that professor. So
Hmm.
I got to dress a certain way. I got to cut my hair. I got to start listening to different music. And like, I tried to mold myself to fit into this particular group. And when I got
Hmm.
into my first pastor role, again, hair cut really short, tattoos all covered, everything like that, and
Hmm.
try to make myself somebody else. And now I'm in this phase of my life where I'm like, you know what? Like I cut my hair long before I was ready to, so I'm gonna let it grow again,
Yeah. Good for
and
you.
my tattoos, I'm gonna show them and I'm gonna
Yeah.
dress the way that I used to. I want to have that
Yes.
back again because I feel like I gave it up long before I wanted to give it up.
Mm.
And so now I'm like giving that myself back that and learning that showing up as who I really am is really what the world needs. And so
Yes.
reading that story,
Yes.
reading your story gave me so much language to put on my own in this season of
Oh,
life that
so
I'm
cool.
in. So I was just so grateful for that.
Oh, I'm thrilled by that because I think I say there's another chapter in the book. It's in the section on staying you. Like I've had the same haircut since I was 8 years old. Like that's not an exaggeration. I'm not somebody who reinvents themselves,
Yeah,
but I think all of us, um, when we have these moments, these examples of showing up as ourselves and then realizing, uh-oh, this that like your story made me laugh because I was trying to apply for an internship at Southern Progress, Southern Living magazine. This was years ago, and I showed up in a in a khaki pantsuit like a professional young journalist. And I looked around and all of the women applying for these same positions, these same internships were in like sundresses and heels. And I was the only person in a pantsuit and khaki. I look back and I'm like, what in the world
khakis.
was I thinking? Khaki pantsuit. I bet you can't even buy a khaki pantsuit now. But and I had a moment just like you did where you're like, uh-oh, like I've made a misstep here. I've miscalculated. And I wound up getting an internship there. Um, but I quickly learned, oh, I'm going to do this company a better service if I'm just who they hired the girl in the suit. So I'm gonna be the girl in the suit, and I'm gonna take this seriously. And if I had been a girl in a sundress, that would have been great too, but that wasn't me. And so I think we actually serve the world better, serve our institutions, our neighborhoods, our communities better when we're ourselves. Because again, it goes back to that's when we're at our most, I think, comfortable, vulnerable, like, yeah, the truest versions of us. And so I think our institutions, our families, they're better for it when we show up as who we really are.
That's right. That's right. All right, section three, and I think we could probably spend the rest of our time, maybe even have multiple episodes of just this section alone. But this one's called Staying Faithful, and
Mhm.
I'd love if you could maybe take our listeners into the story of your faith
Mhm.
evolution a little bit. And
Yeah.
as chapter 10, I think it's chapter 10 describes, sometimes staying true
Mm.
means leaving or walking
Yeah.
away. And so maybe take us into that a bit and probably story swap because, like I said, I feel like we have very similar yet very different stories. But take us
Yeah.
into your faith journey a little bit.
So I was born and raised in the Church of Christ tradition, which it may be a tradition some people aren't super familiar with. I don't know. If you're in the South, you might be familiar with it, but it's fairly conservative. The probably the marker of Church of Christ is that there are no instruments. I feel like that's what most people note the Church of Christ for. So I was born and raised in the Church of Christ. My parents are Church of Christ, were Church of Christ. My grandparents were Church of Christ. Um,
Y'all laid
I
the
went,
first brick in the Christ
yeah,
Church
that's
of
what it
Christ.
kind of felt. That's what it kind of felt like. And the same was true of my husband.
Mm.
We met at Church of Christ College. That's commitment right there to choose a Church of Christ college. And so we were deeply rooted in our faith, both by decisions we'd made on our own and also by the example and the legacy set by our families. And it's one that I would like to be very clear, I'm still grateful for it. Um, I have qualms. I have things that I am still unlearning from that time in my life, but I cannot deny that it introduced me to Jesus, which is something I will never stop being grateful for. And I also met some of the very best people I know through those church experiences. So deeply formed by the Church of Christ, by its theology, and now here we are, and I am unforming some of those things that formed me. So after college, even in college, to be quite frank with you, we went to Church of Christ College, but we both were involved with this Great Books program. So reading all these ancient works, ancient texts, and all of a sudden realizing that maybe the church didn't just start existing in the 1800s. Maybe there was a deep,
What a
uh,
shock, right?
yes, shocking, truly shocking, that the church didn't go underground for for centuries. Um, and so through actually the irony being through our Church of Christ college experience, both of us, both Jordan and I, started to I think ask questions, and I'd always been a question asker.
That can get you in
And
trouble, right?
yes, it can. Well, especially so Jordan's path, it has ultimately led us mostly to the same spot. But like his path, he is deeply interested in church history, in theology, and so his path kind of took him that way. Mine certainly is rooted in my gender and the fact that the way I grew up really limited what I could do as a woman in church. And so the questions that I think anybody would be in the Church of Christ, those questions felt a little dangerous, right? But I think especially when they're asked by a woman, felt even more dangerous. And so anyway, through Jordan's questions about church history, through my own questions about perhaps the literal interpretation of scripture, and then my own dabblings in the church calendar, in the writings of Phyllis Tickle, in some of the beautiful prayers that are found in the Book of Common Prayer. We both have found ourselves practicing more liturgical worship. And so we were drawn in our town to an Anglican church. Um, our faith, I now hold faith decisions quite loosely. That's a theme throughout the book is learning to hold things with an open hand. And so I always say that that's where we are right now. I don't know what the future holds. I think one thing I've learned over the last 10, 20 years is that scripture about working out your salvation with fear and trembling is something I'll be doing my whole life. Um, and if I can actually just accept that, maybe it won't be quite so uncomfortable as it was for the 24, 25-year-old version of myself. It was quite painful. I think I say in the book it was deconstruction before that was a word we were all using. I didn't know that's what I was doing. Um, and I don't, and I, s- you know, there's part of me that's like, was that what I was doing? But I guess that it was deconstructing and reconstructing, trying to like rebuild and refigure out, okay, well, what do I think then? What do I believe then? Um, and again, I'm always going to ask questions. That's who I am. I'm never not going to have questions. But I do feel, at least in our current faith home, those questions are no longer seen as a liability, but instead they're just a part of a life of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I think similar to you, I had a experience where coming out of seminary, I was taught that, this is the way church history has always been, and this
Mm,
is the theology we've always had, and it came from Jesus and was handed to the apostles, and like that's it. And there's all these
mhm,
other, false ones. They were heretics, and that's why they were thrown aside. I'm like, okay, whatever. Well, what
mhm.
about like, the Gospel of Thomas? Don't read that. Okay. What about the Gospel of Mary? Don't read that. Okay. I was the Christian soldier who just did what I was
Yeah.
told. And then when I started to, deconstruct, like,
Hmm.
I wonder what this stuff says. Then I came
Hmm.
across people like Barterman, Elaine Pagels. I'm
Hmm.
like, these are people who are scholars. They must have something interesting to say. And I started
Right.
reading. I'm like, man, I didn't realize that the history of Christianity is so wide and so diverse. Like I said,
Yes.
I've been oblivious to this. I've gone through 3 years of a master's program, 3 years of a doctoral program. How am I not knowing this stuff? How was
Mm-hmm.
I given such a narrow
Mm-hmm.
explanation of church history? And I got really angry for a while. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
really grateful for my tradition because like you introduced me to Jesus. It introduced me to this way of life that I think I'll always live all of my
Mm-hmm.
days. But I was so upset because I didn't realize how diverse it really was, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore how many people I excluded on my own
Yes.
journey because I was taught
Yes.
that this is the way that it is. And I was just
Yes.
so upset. And so I'm a book guy, so I just threw myself into all these different books and read all these different things, and actually relieved a lot of weight because I had a lot of questions. Like you, I was always the
Mm-hmm.
guy asking the questions, and was just told, well, just have faith. This is the way that it is. I'm like, okay, well, I guess so. But then I started reading these other texts, realizing, wow, these people thought about these questions I had
Yeah.
in much different ways than I've ever thought about them. And it gave me almost permission to really allow my own mind to expand. So I feel like my faith today, again, like I've stayed faithful, even though
Mm-hmm.
I've left some of my tradition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think there's a sense of relief that comes from realizing that faith and church, it's all so much wider than we thought. I was definitely raised in an insular um, faith that even perhaps had an element of exclusivity to it. And the older I've gotten and the more reading I've done, the more people I've met, um, you just realize how wide and how vast, um, even for me, the Christian community is. And then even further beyond that. But like, I think I was raised to think that we had it all figured out. And then that meant no one else had it figured out. And so what a relief it has been to realize that none of us has it fully figured out. And that's what faith is. And so I think I describe in the book this um, doesn't mean it's not painful, but this wide vastness um, of God, like that it's just so much bigger than I ever thought. And boy, am I grateful that it's bigger than I thought. Um, and so, I think that is one of my, um, yeah, biggest lessons, or I hope it's something that I cling to through the next parts of my faith journey, wherever they may take me, that like faith is big, God is big, our questions are okay. Um, because I was raised perhaps in a tighter environment.
Yeah, that's right. Hope you don't mind if we're story swapping because everything you
No, I
say
love it.
reminds me of a story. But
Yeah.
you said in I forget what chapter it was in, but you talk about how when you left church or you left that part of your journey when you departed the church of
Hmm.
your upbringing, however we want to phrase it, you did
Yeah.
it for yourself, for your husband, for your
Hmm.
future, and you also say that for your future children,
Hmm.
because like had you raised children with the same wounds that you had, you would have no idea
Hmm.
how to help them if you were still
Yeah.
within that space. And so for me, like again, like it brought me back to when my daughter was born. I have this very vivid memory of laying on our bed one night and an absolutely exhausted parent. By the way, our daughter was an infant and she's like wide awake and drooling everywhere, just trying to get this kid to go to sleep. And I was reading for her from a children's Bible that we had gotten her.
Hmm.
And I got to this part about Jesus's death. And although it was, told in a very kid-friendly way, the
Hmm.
message was, we're bad.
Mhm.
and God is mad, and we need
Mhm.
to accept Jesus into our hearts so he won't be mad at
Mm.
us anymore. And I remember, like, I
Mm.
was exhausted, like I said, I was tired, and I got like halfway through the story, and I just shut the book, and I said to my wife, like, I have been through an obscene amount of schooling to learn the ins and outs of this message, and like this, I know this theology like the back of my hand. I
Mhm.
said, but now, as a father, I said, I feel like I have to voice this. I think it's just absolutely ridiculous. And I
Mhm.
had so many questions. And again, the temptation for me was to stay, right? Because then
Mm.
again, going back to being like what everybody wants me to be, to
Yeah.
smile, to nod, to ignore the questions, to repeat the script from the pulpit,
Mhm.
every single Sunday and just have faith that this is the way it is and God's going to work it all out in the end. But, I couldn't do that. And
Mhm.
then, being in that world for so long, and I'm sure you can speak to this too, I had friends,
Yeah.
pastors, congregants, professors, classmates, deans, denominational leaders, like friends, who I was close
Yes.
to, and I was becoming somebody in that world. And so
Mhm.
leaving in an effort to stay faithful and explore the questions and see where they would
Mhm.
take me, even voicing those questions out loud, what's gonna be, I was like, this is
Mm.
gonna be a huge, huge risk to travel down this road. And but I was just beginning, like even in that moment, I was just starting to think back on like how the theology that I was given wounded me in different ways. And as I held my
Mhm.
daughter that night, I just had this like overwhelming resolve. I don't know where it came from, but it came from like my depths that like
Mhm.
I will be damned if I'm gonna let her
Mhm.
grow up with the same kind of wounding. Like I need
Yeah.
to give myself permission to ask questions so that one day she'll have permission to ask her own questions. And so
That's the
again, it took
key.
us to
Yeah.
this place, but I think it's such a good place.
I think so. My brother and I have these conversations all the time. He has a son, and so even before I became pregnant, we were talking because I think all of us who have wound, which by the way, we all do, like we all have woundings, whether it's from in my case, maybe it's from our religious upbringing or
Mhm.
whatever, but we all have these things, right? It's why so many of us are in therapy.
Right. Keep the therapist in business.
That's right. And so I think there's a part of us that might think, oh, I can prevent this wounding in my own children. And my brother and I were talking, and he and I are very similar personalities, and he was so concerned about this one thing. And I did gently tell him, I said, your son is going to have his own woundings that you are not going to be able to prevent. But I think we are trying to not make the same mistakes. We're still going to make mistakes. We're still going to pass on things that, oops, wish we hadn't done that. But the what we're giving our children or our next generation, whether it's our literal children or our metaphorical children, what we're hopefully passing on to them is exactly what you've stated, which is room to ask questions. And that they won't be punished for having questions. They won't be diminished for having questions. They won't be ignored for having questions. And so I wanted to tell my brother to like take that pressure off himself because we are still going to make mistakes, even if we don't make the same mistakes our parents or grandparents did. We're still going to make our own. Um, but if we can maybe do a little bit better, if we can impart maybe um, a new lesson to them, then they still might have woundings, but their woundings will look a little different, and maybe we'll at least have them open to whatever might come next. Because that's what I would want is for our future children to know how big and how wide faith is and how much room there is for them. And so, yeah, I think that that's why I say holding things loosely. Um, I don't know what the future holds for my faith. But I think what the past 10 to 20 years taught me is that you can still be faithful while asking questions, while I mean, you name a denomination, we tried it. Like while you're still kind of figuring things out, like it's okay to be figuring things out. That's okay. Um, and and I'm grateful. I'm grateful to have traveled that road in my late 20s and into my 30s because there will come another season, I'm sure, where I have to do it again.
Yeah, it's the deconstruction is like layer by layer. I feel like
Right.
it's one layer. Oh, I think I've done it now, and that's oh wait a minute. There's another layer. We're gonna go a little bit deeper into the
Yes.
onion. But I feel
Yeah.
like, I think about my daughter, and I feel like one of the things that this part of my journey has hopefully given her is even like the freedom to know you can change your mind. Because
Yes.
like we were talking the other night, we were laying in bed. I was telling her some different stories and stuff, and she said, somebody in school was talking about hell, and she said, "Do you believe in that?" And I was like, "Wow." I was like, "Well, what do you think?" Put it back on her,
Good one.
Yeah. And she's like, "Well, I don't really feel like that's something that I believe in." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I used to believe in it." And she goes, "You did?" And I was like, "Yeah." I said, "I was a pastor, and I said I stood in the church every morning, and I would tell people about it, and I had all these
Mhm.
different Bible verses that I used to explain it to people." And she's like, "So it is real?" And I was like, "Well," I said, "now I don't really think so anymore." I said, "I think
Mm,
maybe the language in the Bible that's talking about those various things, that I think maybe it might mean something different." So we talked about all these different
mm,
things, and she goes, "So you used to believe it, but you don't." I said, "Exactly." And I said, "You know what is really important about that?" And she said, "What?" I said, "You can change your mind." I
mm,
said, "Look at me." I said, "I went to school for all these years and I learned about that amongst many other things." I said, "But now I'm 43 years old." I said, "I've had
mhm,
other life experiences." And I said, "I've changed my mind." And I said, "You need to know that as you grow up, you can always change your mind, whether it's about
mhm,
things about God or things about other things." I said, "But people are
mhm,
going to pressure you to
mm,
believe a certain way." And I said, "There's just like I just asked you, do you believe in that?" And you said no. I said, "Because there's a little voice inside that
mhm,
tells you, you know, you can listen to that voice. You don't always have
mhm,
to listen to all the outside voices. As if you
mm,
can still yourself inside and listen to that voice, it's going to direct you different places. So when you grow up, you might change your mind. Maybe you will
mhm.
believe." I said, "I don't know." I said, "But it's going to be your journey." But giving her that freedom, I feel like it's just such a
Yes.
healthy thing that I didn't get. Doesn't sound like you got. And I think
Yeah.
like I'm going to give her her own wounds. But I feel like
Yeah.
if that's one thing I can not give her, that's a
Yes.
success, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the freedom to, yeah, change your mind is a beautiful gift.
Yeah, so good. All right, well, we are just about out of time. This has been a
Yeah.
lot of fun. I appreciate you. I appreciate your work.
Thank
Real
you.
quick, is there any place you want to direct people to go online to follow you, follow your
Yeah.
work? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. You can follow me at Annie B. Jones 05. I do think it's funny. I was not early enough to just get Annie B. Jones, so please don't
You're
forget
number
the
five.
05. It doesn't even stand for anything. It was just like, I guess maybe I was the fifth Annie B.
I
Jones.
love it.
So Annie B. Jones 05. You can also follow my bookstore at Bookshelf Tville. You can even shop with us online if you're a long distance. If you're nowhere near Thomasville, Georgia, that's not a problem. You can shop with us at bookshelfthomasville.com, and you can find me and more of my writing at anniebjoneswrites.com.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. This was wonderful.
Thank you.